Hello, thank you for joining me today. My doctoral project focuses on the French musicians Lucien Capet and Marcel Tabuteau. How I came to research these musicians was actually initially because of a question, a very simple one. How do you know how much bow to use on any given note? This is coming from the standpoint that I was often using too much bow and therefore wasn't getting the right sound quality or phrasing that I was wanting. But I felt that I was trying a lot of random things and not making much success. So I decided to search for treatises or any writings that would tell me, hey, this is how you would do it. Lucien Capet fit the bill. His treatise, the one thing his treatise is remembered for is very detailed bow divisions. So that would tell me, okay, this is how you divide your bow and the thought process behind it. But what I came to find through practicing his examples, he has a lot of technical exercises, and through reading his treatise, I felt that I was missing the link between the technical concept of how to translate your musical thought into technique, but not the other way. I felt like I found the resource for translating your musical thought into technique, but I still didn't know how to develop the musical thought process and create compelling phrasing. Luckily, someone happened to recommend the book Sound in Motion by David McGill to me, and that whole book is built on the principles of the French musician, oboist, Marcel Tabuteau. He had a very unique approach to phrasing. What he is remembered for is the number system, using numbers to describe phrasing. We'll get more into that later in the section about him. But what I realized was that the number system is just one part of the approach to phrasing. He had tons of different ideas about how to make things sound natural and how to understand the fundamentals of music, the building blocks of music, and how they fit into the bigger structure. Studying these two musicians led me to realize that they actually have a lot of similarities. And it makes sense because they were both from France and they both went to the Paris Conservatory. Although they were not overlapping when they were there, Capet's treatise was used at the conservatory, and it's very likely that that's where Tabuteau came across it. In fact, at the end of one lesson, John Delancey, Tabuteau's former student, recounted that he handed him a treatise and it was Capet's, and he was told to go study it. When you look at the way Tabuteau taught technique and all the different exercises dedicated to absolute breath control of the sound, it looks very similar to the way Capet taught absolute bow control. So that's a little bit about why I decided to research this topic. And what I aim to prove and to show is that through studying Capet and Tabuteau, together you have this very solid foundation, you have this very solid process for developing your musical thought and experimenting so you can be more creative in your musical process. A musician's musical ability is often debated as whether or not it is nature or nurture. For most of history, it was just assumed that you either have it or you don't, and you cannot be taught to play in a musical way. At the end of the day, of course, there are some that have a gift for it and pick up things faster, but this paper just wants to address those who just want to refine their ability, or they want to teach a young student how to process how technique is married to musicality. And there are some tools that can help them to do this. In language, we have our letters, which are grouped into words, which are grouped into sentences, into complete phrases. In music, we have our single notes grouped into different pairs or larger groups, into phrases and sentences as well, into whole sections. The way we perform language in music is similar too. Think of a monotone reading of an essay. For example, I was listening back to my thesis with Microsoft Word's read back. And while I can understand everything that it's saying, because all the words are spoken correctly and punctuation is acknowledged, it stops when there's a period, there's a pause, and there's a comma, it still loses the effect compared to if you were to nuance certain words, highlight them in order to bring attention to what you want your listener to hear. And if you do it in an effective way where you are pacing yourself, then you can really capture the attention of your audience and keep them engaged. So that's the number one premise. That because we know how to speak, and we've been spending our whole lives learning to speak, regardless of what language, we can take that thought process of how do I become more charismatic, how do I speak clearly, more effectively, all those things can be translated into the way you play. The next thing I talk about is actually inspired by a book I was reading, Mindset. In it, it was talking about how to learn to draw is actually not about simply drawing skills, but rather learning to see. And once you learn to see, then you can try to replicate what you have seen. I argue that Lucien Capet actually, through his treatise, created a very effective way to train our ears to listen in a very detailed way. And it's not just because he has multitudes of exercises, but actually it's what he says about the exercises and what he constantly reminds the violinist to focus on that creates the listening exercise part. I researched many different books and works that discussed either rules on phrasing, or it was a technical book that had some rules. For example, Leopold Mozart, his treatise on the violin, a lot of it was dedicated to technique, but it also tried to establish rules for what you do when there's an upbeat, a downbeat, a this and a that. Francesco Geminiani, he took a similar but much looser approach. I think it must be reflective of certain personality types, but he just set down a couple of guidelines and hoped that your innate sense of good taste would take over. So while I found a lot of these very fascinating and I learned a lot, then it still feel like it was memorizing a rule book. On the other hand, you have Tabuteau, whose approach to phrasing is very sprawling and really has no beginning and end, just in the sense that everything is interrelated, and just due to music's subjective nature, it's very hard to codify. I did find, though, in Advancing Violin's Handbook, a really concise and great description of 4 musical laws. And it was in the book, The Advancing Violinist's Handbook by Benjamin Whipcomb. The first law is, every instant of music must always be played with direction. Number 2, all music either sings, speaks, or dances, or some combination thereof, and should be played accordingly. Number 3, most music tells a story. The musical shapes must fit the structure, the plot, and the drama of this storyline. Number 4, maybe my favorite and probably the hardest, music must sound spontaneous, but inevitable. These laws really summarize what Tabuteau was teaching and what his students reflected about his teaching too. So throughout my thesis, I rely on those principles to help me decide my musical choices, and that's what helped me when I was practicing also. Now, moving on to Lucien Capet, he wrote a very comprehensive treatise on bowing called Superior Bowing Technique. From the very beginning, he reminds you that artistry is the number one priority and technique is just in service to that. So I know that a lot of treatises say that, of course, but later on, if you look through his writings, which are scattered in between throughout those technical exercises, he constantly is reminding you that what he's trying to develop is a refinement of technique so that you can create a lot of different shades of color and be able to understand and process it and have a logic to it. Here is his diagram explaining the divisions of the bow. As you can see, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them, or 4 if you don't count the whole bow. Here is a B division, half the bow. 1, 2. C divisions are in fourths. 1, 2, 3, 4. D is in eighths. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then the last one, E, is in thirds. 1, 2, 3. So that's how he's thinking about how to divide the bow. And in any situation, he figures out, you know, what's the big beat and how many notes are within that big beat. What is the most logical and mathematical way to divide the bow? Here's an example. We have the starting at division D7, and then we go to D8. So we have basically a 16th of the bow per 16th note. And then continue like this. You end up in D5 and then B2. This image is exactly the same as the previous one I played for you, but he zooms out and uses bigger bow divisions. So it really depends on what you're looking for, but you can switch between bow divisions just to, you know, fine tune each individual note, or you can have a more general sense. This next one is an example of incorrect bow divisions. So, not really any logic to it, and it causes swells where it's not indicated. One really helpful resource that I'm very thankful that exists, Capet, while he was writing this treatise around that time, he also worked with Edition Nationale and created a whole bunch of annotated editions of etudes of Kreutzer, Fiorillo, Mazzas. He also annotated Bach's violin sonatas and partitas. The one I'll be playing for you later is from the third partita, Gavotte and Rondeau, Minuet 1 and 2. So I chose these for demonstration. Here is how Capet suggests dividing the bow. So starting at C2. Here's how he might suggest playing this passage. He actually has you do it all under one slur with stop bows. Starting in E2. It's like he's taking advantage of that natural taper. And he does a similar thing, for example, 3. In the Minuet, number 1, he starts here in E, so the 2nd, 3rd, and it goes all the way to the tip. And then C4, the upper quarter, and then upper 2/3. Then we have again, same thing, upper quarter, and 2/3. Something like this. So, just from playing his bow divisions, you get a sense of how he might have sounded. And I think that was the most fascinating realization for me, that, oh, you can represent your sound and what you're doing technically on paper. I think this reflects his very solid and grounded manner of playing, which when I read about his playing style, everyone was marveling at how smooth and consistent of a tone he has. And if you read just a little bit of the treatise, he can't stop talking about a smooth line above all. So here's an example of how I tried using his bow divisions in the Brahms Violin Concerto. I chose this section. When I was first practicing it, I was definitely using bow inconsistently and couldn't get the melodic line to come out the way I wanted to. So I tried playing it and dividing it in this way, with every beat getting a third of the bow. That was the most equal I figured I could do it. So I thought using a whole bow will be an interesting exercise. I later changed it and tried to adjust how much bow I use on certain notes to bring them out. But as I said, that can get a little messy, and I wished there was a way to be a little bit more systematic in deciding these phrasing choices. What I took away from practicing Capet, again, is that you can reflect your sound in the notation. But it still left me wondering, how exactly do you decide your musical ideas? Clearly he had a sense of it inside already, and he was reflecting it through technique. This leads us to Marcel Tabuteau and his approach to phrasing. The foundation of Tabuteau's approach to phrasing are up and down notes. Up being active, it's actively going up and leading somewhere. Down being passive, and it works with gravity, it drops, it lands. The golden rule is that you should never break an up and down pair. In fact, even if a piece starts on 1, there's always an upbeat. And 1. Just like a conductor has to prep to start. Or if you are throwing a ball, you must reach back, prepare the motion, and then throw it. Here was a demonstration that I thought made it pretty clear the difference between grouping up and down pairs correctly and incorrectly. If we think about our music notation, we know that notes are beamed by rhythm and for ease of reading rather than anything musical. So really what he is doing is regrouping all the notes to be musically correct, harmonically grouped correctly. So here is the Surprise Symphony by Haydn, notated 2 ways by Tabuteau himself to highlight the difference between correct and incorrect. The first way, we always have down, down, up, up, down, up, up, down, down, up, down, down, up, up, down, down, up, down, down, up, up, down, down, up, down, down, up, up, down, up. While you were listening to that, maybe you noticed that it felt very square and didn't really have any momentum. It wasn't leading anywhere because it always down, down, up, up, down. Very stuck. Now, here's how he notated it to give it a little more forward momentum. The first note is an establishing note, so it starts by itself, down, and then we start the up-down pairs. Up, down, up, down, up, up. Here he wanted a lift, and then down, up, down, up, down, up, up, because he doesn't want to end. And then down, up, down, up, down, up, up, down, up, down, up, down, up. That creates a sense that every single note is tied to the next, to the next, to the next, and therefore you have this long unbroken thread that creates direction, life in the music. He would have his students practice scales in this way too. F major, if you just consider 1, 5, 1 as the basic harmonic movement, so 1, up, 5, down, and then up, back to 1. The harmonic context reflects in the groupings. One thing to note is that the up and downs, they can be applied to each individual note, but it can also be applied to beats, to the whole measure. There can be an upward feeling measure that leads to a down measure. And if you really wanted to, I'm sure there's a way to consider the overall gesture of an entire section if it's an up leading to some middle part that is more declamatory. It can be really scaled to what you need to explore. Now, taking that scale, I'd like to apply some numbers to it. He used numbers in many different ways, so it gets very confusing and it's a little bit messy. He himself said that it's been changing and in progress his whole career. So here in this scale, we have our establishing note, 1, and to convey the direction that we're leading to the dominant, to contrast, maybe something like this. It feels like you're holding your breath randomly. Now moving on, I think this is one of my favorite demonstrations by Tabuteau of the use of his number system and how he thought. The numbers that he uses for this are 1 1 2 2 2 3 3 3 4 3 1 1 2 2 2 3 3 2. It'll take me some time before I can shape it quite like he does, but I see the path. Here's a diagram. I didn't put in my initial markings of up and down notes because it was a bit too messy. But how I grouped everything was by first establishing, is this an up note or down? I'll put the up and downs in pairs, and then I group the pairs into bigger sections, bigger chunks. And if you see on the side, I write syllables, words, phrase, sentence to remind us of how it's kind of like language. We are breaking down notes, putting them together into words, and then eventually creating large phrases. I tried using his numbers to help me explore how to shape this passage. Number 1, I did break this section down and look at the skeletal structure, which is just arpeggios. And from there, I also made sure to figure out which notes were up notes and down notes. And from there, that's how I decided the numbers. If I were to sing it, 1, 1, 2, 3, 3, 4, 3, 4, 5, 5, 4, 1, sorry, 3, 4, 4, 5, 6, 4, 5, 6, 6, 5. Repeated numbers mean there's no connection. Consecutive numbers mean that there is a connection. In the final part of my paper, I introduce phrase sketching, which is something I came up with because I found that there was a couple more details about the bow I wanted to be able to represent when I was exploring and experimenting with different musical ideas. The first being sounding point. To represent this, I used colors because I thought they were the most easy to remember, the order at least, and pretty quick to associate with different sounding points. So red, orange, yellow, green, blue. And the next one would be speed. I tried to keep this simple as well. Fast, medium, slow. F, M, S. If you wanted, you could have very fast, VF, or very slow, VS. So slow being medium and fast. With weight, I chose to represent it with a scale of numbers 1 to 5, 1 being the lightest. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, I wanted to be able to play with the different variables and combine them. So here's an example of that. I have a piano going to mezzo forte. So I start at blue, I eventually get to yellow, and then back to blue. And another example. We have 4 quarter notes, forte, forte, a sforzando, and then a regular note again. Now if you notice, I kind of got a little bit of a scratchy sound. That's because probably this sounding point plus that speed and weight doesn't quite work. So that's actually one of the most effective uses of the tool, I thought, was learning what works and what doesn't. I applied it to the opening of the exposition of the Brahms Violin Concerto, the solo line. As you can see, I went through it and generally loosely marked out where I'd be playing it in the bow, what kind of weight and speed that I'd be using. I could have been more detailed and I could have been more general. Again, it's up to what you are trying to focus on. I was mainly trying to understand the overall shape, and if you see in this middle section, I start with a blue, green, yellow, orange. I was trying to get a crescendo leading to that forte. I wanted to mention that I didn't stick precisely to these notations. Really, I drew these initially, and from there, I had a different way of thinking about how to use my bow. I found that this was a very useful tool in the initial stages. Again, sketching, that's why I called it. You get a rough idea of the details, and then you can fill it in and fill it in and fill it in to make a complete picture. So in summary, I hoped to share a way to teach musicality, a way to learn to listen. And these were inspired by the ideas of Lucien Capet and Marcel Tabuteau. They have a complementary system of thinking about music, which was really inspiring because, again, it's frustrating not to know what you want, but now that there's somewhat of a process, then the possibilities are endless. I wanted to say thank you so much to my family for all their support through all these years. Thank you to José Guzmán for being by my side and cheering me on through this process. Thank you to my committee, especially my professor Janice Lee, for your patience and support. I really appreciate everything I've learned in my time at University of Hanoi. So thank you very much.